Better. Okay. So yesterday we left off. We had been talking about this. Well, been talking about the kind of the. There's some key points in the history of Earth that you need to know. And the first one of those is the first that we know of. The first fossils we have date back to 3.5 billion years ago. Remember, the Earth is. We estimated it around 4.5 to 4.6 billion years old. So it took a billion years for us to get to these tiny little things called stromatolites that are bacteria-like, and they were our first, at least those were our first fossils. But it does look like prokaryotes. Yep, they're the winners. They were the first inhabitants of the Earth. And they stayed that way for a very long time, for more than a billion years. So sometimes they show you these clocks, and the clock is showing the present time up here. But then this is, it's also it's the beginning and the end, so to speak. So it's the beginning of time as well. So the present is this line, but it is also representing where the Earth first started. So if we go around that clock and we get to this line here, we can see that prokaryotes have been around for about 3.5 billion years ago. So that's the first milestone that you should have in your head, is that 3.5 billion years ago. Now, remember that during this time, there was no free oxygen in the atmosphere. So that first billion years, there wasn't any oxygen. It was all in things like water, or carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. And it took a long time for that to build up in the atmosphere. Now, what that means is that there was no ozone, because oxygen can form into another molecule called O3, and O3 is ozone. And ozone is that layer in our clouds, in our atmosphere, that protects the Earth from hazardous ultraviolet radiation. Basically from zapping things so that life can be on the Earth in the first place. Well, again, hypothesis, because we don't know necessarily how this all worked, but we hypothesized that to begin with, because there was no oxygen, that life must have not only began as prokaryotes, but it also must have began in the ocean and deep in the ocean, so that any light coming from the sun would not have affected the developing creatures, because that UV ray would be really, really intense without any ozone layer. That we know of, anything living could not develop that way. So it would have to be so deep that it couldn't actually get to those organisms that were starting to evolve. So that ozone layer was really important. Well, if we go back to the next slide, our next clock, about 2.7 billion years ago is when we started to see oxygen being released as a byproduct. And that was a byproduct of what process that we've talked about? What would produce oxygen as a byproduct? Photosynthesis, yeah. So gradually, the oxygen built up. It took quite a while for that to happen. It took not a billion years, but about 300 million years for that to build up to its present level of about 10%. This was important in a few ways. First of all, it led to things who were able to, it led to the development of aerobic respiration. But it also led to the extinction of a lot of prokaryotes, because a lot of prokaryotes, the oxygen in the air was poisonous to them, was toxic, and it actually led to their demise and their extinction. So one group started to rise and another group started to kind of recede over time. Our first eukaryotic cells date back to about 1.8 billion years ago. And if you remember back in the beginning of the year, we talked about how eukaryotes, we believe, they were around before, but they were much simpler prokaryotes that were gobbled up by a larger cell. And then those, once they were inside of that cell, instead of being digested and eaten, they continued to evolve and change. And some of them evolved into things like the mitochondria, also chloroplasts. Both of those are believed to have been their own prokaryotic organism living on their own prior to being taken in by a larger cell and kind of being the precursor to a eukaryotic cell. And this is just showing that. I'm not going to dwell on that too much because we've seen it before. But they do like to test you on the idea of like, why is this hypothesis believed to be, or this theory believed to be true? And one of the key pieces of evidence is the fact that there's double membranes. So you see double membranes in mitochondria and chloroplasts, as well as a couple other organelles. And those plasma membranes look like living bacteria, look like living prokaryotes. The inner one does. The inner membranes do. They also divide on their own. They don't have to divide with the rest of the cell dividing as well. And they have DNA. None of the organelles have their own DNA. The DNA looks like DNA that would belong to a prokaryote, so it's circular. And then they're also able to perform gene expression on their own. So they don't have to use the nucleus to go through that whole process of transcribing and translating DNA. They have the ability to do it on their own. Oh, and then there's ribosomes that are similar to what bacterial ribosomes look like rather than eukaryotic ribosomes, sorry. So that's another key feature. And that all suggests that, yep, these guys came from prokaryotic cells. Okay, so other things we need to talk about when we talk about history of the Earth, one of the things that is very evident in the fossil record is that there is gaps where the number of species in the world goes down significantly. And we know that these are mass extinction events that could have changed for a variety of reasons, but this tends to happen. And in the history of Earth over the 4.5 billion years or 4.6 billion years, there's been 5 of them have happened during that time. And during that time, 50% or more of the species that lived in the water, so marine animals, became extinct. So it's a big deal. And it kind of resets. What's that? What are the 5? I can go back and I can look. I can't tell you off the top of my head. Latest one would be the one that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. What's that? So I don't remember it was during the Permian, I think. Permian. Is it up here? No, it's not. About here. I thought there was one slide that said, I think it was Cretaceous, the Cretaceous one. And during the last mass extinction, it might have been Cretaceous, but don't quote me on that. What ended up happening was meteors struck the Earth, we think. Not sure, but if you go down to Mexico, there's a crater that's miles across in diameter. And the result of that put so much soot, because it burned for a very long time, because it was very, very large. It put soot into the air, so much soot, so much dust, debris, that it blocked the sun, not completely, but it led to the Earth being much colder. And the problem was dinosaurs were ectotherms. They were cold-blooded. So because they were cold-blooded, they needed it warm. And so that led to their extinction because they couldn't deal with those extreme temperatures. And that's also when warm-blooded or endotherms started to really take over, because they could survive. It wasn't, necessarily the most fun environment to be in, but they could survive in it. Is the mass sixth underway? Scientists estimate that we have a higher rate of extinction right now than what's typical seen in the fossil records. But it's kind of hard to know whether or not that is just natural or it's man-made because of global climate change. Climate change has caused a lot of species to decline. We know that extinction rates go up when it gets really warm. A lot of species can't live with that, and they just cease to be. Plus, we know that human beings we're introducing things in places they're not supposed to be. That hurts extinctions. There's overharvesting. There's all the land that we've turned under for agricultural reasons and for human reasons. So data suggests that there is a sixth human-caused mass extinction that's taking place. Time will tell whether or not that actually plays out or not, depending on what we do as a human race. Hopefully something. Come on, move. Okay, it takes a long time to recover from these. So it takes the Earth about 5 to 10 million years to recover, and in some cases up to 100 million years to get back up to the species level that you had beforehand. Mass extinctions change the types of organisms that are found in the community. So like I said, with the dinosaurs eventually it led to their demise because they just couldn't survive in that cold of an environment. But it also led to mammals. It led to mammals coming out of a lot of places that they had been before they had their territory was very limited because they had to watch out for the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs took a lot of the territory, and now they weren't there anymore. So it let them go out into the world in places that they hadn't occupied before. Yeah.
So this might be a dumb question. Like, since they talk about, like, I don't know if it's like literally, but they say like there are some animals now that like have either, I don't know if the same exact species, but like been around since the dinosaurs were around. Does that mean they just survived it, or like? Yeah,
it does mean they survived it. So, for example, is it alligators or crocodiles? Crocodiles are pretty closely related to dinosaurs, so they made it.
Okay.
The other thing that we think happened is that at least part of the dinosaurs, quote, made it, but they made it as birds.
Oh.
So there's actually transitional fossils that we've been able to find that look sort of like dinosaurs, but they also look like birds.
Okay.
We call them transitional fossils because they've got teeth like the dinosaurs would have, but then they have obvious indications that they must have had feathers as well. So
dinosaurs had like feathers?
Some dinosaurs did, yeah. Yeah, there's a dinosaur, or I shouldn't say dinosaur, a fossil called Archaeopteryx. It's only found in Germany, so there's only a few places that you find the fossil, but they found a lot of them there. And they look like they're halfway in between a bird and a dinosaur. So it's kind of cool. So Earth was formed about 4.6 billion years ago. We talked about that as well. This is kind of a random slide that really should have been back when we talked about Miller and that glass tube experiment. The biggest point out that I'll do here is that remember that there was no free oxygen on Earth, but there was nitrogen and nitrogen components or nitrogen compounds, as well as carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen, ammonia. So not very hospitable things to begin with. But then there was that chemical evolution that led to, we think, things like amino acids and lipids and other macromolecules eventually. Okay, so adaptive radiation plays in nicely here because, like I said, so the dinosaurs, for example, they became less and less common. And because they became less and less common, that meant that now mammals could go out into the environment because they could live in colder temperatures. And they could occupy areas that that were no longer occupied by those predators. And so we have this term called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation is where you get one species, but parts of that species go off and occupy a particular niche or a particular area of the world. or of an environment, and another part of the same species goes off and occupies a slightly different one. And so over time, they start to diverge, and they start to develop different characteristics, and eventually they become different species. So we did see, like I said, a lot of mammals and a lot of different mammal species developing after the dinosaurs and after that mass extinction, because now they could go wherever they wanted to and go to whatever environment they were best suited for. And so adaptive radiation often follows mass extinctions, which we were talking about. And they can then cause pretty rapid evolution as well of things that are new that we've never seen before, characteristics. And that leads, again, to this change in species. Okay, this is kind of fun and weird. So kind of related to this whole idea of, there's a mass extinction, and then all of a sudden the species that come back are not exactly necessarily the same ones that were there before. A lot of times they come back differently than they did before. So we think that a lot of that comes from changes in the sequences and the regulation of genes that are only used during development. So there are a set of genes that we have that are turned on during development that allow us to produce, for example, limbs or eyes, or wings, whatever it happens to be. So a lot of people study these genes to see what they can learn from them, and there's been some kind of wiggity whack stuff that they've done with them. One set of genes are called homeotic genes, and homeotic genes are the developmental genes that are going to code for basic where basic features are in the body. They kind of figure out the body plan. They say the wings go here, the legs go here, the arms go here. Okay? So that everything is laid down in the right place, so we don't get a pair of limbs in the wrong position or wings in the wrong position, or not even having wings at all produced. In animals, there's a subset of homeotic genes called Hox genes. And these are only found, like it says here, in animal embryonic development. They're there all the time, but they're turned off. If a Hox gene is, remember, every cell in your body has the same DNA, but a large chunk of it is turned off because it's not needed. So what happens is these Hox genes are supposed to be turned on in certain spots to tell you, okay, I need wings here or I need arms here. But it is possible for those genes to be turned on in the wrong location. And sometimes that just produces something that's really weird, and sometimes it could produce things that are actually functional. And there's an example here, but let me just show you this funky picture that I think I pulled off the internet. They did this. They genetically enhanced this. They not genetically enhanced, altered it, so that this is a real picture of a real fly. But his eyes are those red pieces right there. But these are legs. They're coming off of his head because they turned on those Hox genes in the head area. And then that led to the production of those appendages on the head. Okay? And sometimes that happens. This was done by humans, but sometimes that happens. Let me show you an example of that here. Yeah.
It's kind of like a goofy question, but like how they did that, like how did they turn on the oxygen?
Well, there's regulators that turn those things off. There's, remember we talked about methylation and acetylation? So it's possible that they were able to somehow unwind it so it would become produced. Probably more likely that it was a chemical alteration that they did, but I don't know that for sure. Exactly. Okay, this is a little critter on the left. I actually counted it up. This little thing had 11 pairs of legs. It's a lot. It's funny that I don't know, for some reason I think it should be even, not odd. They had 11 pairs of legs. And we think what happened is over time, some of those genes got turned off. Gesundheit. So they didn't produce as many legs. And so our current kind of fly body plan is having those two legs in the back and having two pairs in the front. But then this pink area or the green area here and pink area here, what ended up happening was those UBX, are called UBX genes that code for legs, got turned off. So we lost, they're still there and they can still be turned on, like the fly with the legs coming off the head. But they were turned off so that now we have a different body plan. Okay? So things like that happen over time. Yeah. So a possible mechanism for the evolution of the six-legged insects came from a many-legged crustacean ancestor. And that's been demonstrated in lab experiments. They've actually been able to see that. Yeah.
So these type of things could like never happen to humans?
They could in theory, and sometimes we do get weird things. We get things like a little tail, right? Like post-anal tail, or we get webbing. So those things are supposed to be turned off during development, but they're not turned off for some reason that we aren't really aware of. Yeah. So they could, theoretically. No, it's not too common. Are you thinking that you'd be a faster swimmer? Actually, I did have a kid once who had, I think, a little bit of webbing on their toes, I think.
Toes.
Yeah. And he was a swimmer.
Oh, he was a swimmer?
He was a swimmer.
That actually work.
I don't know. It isn't like you could compare. You just had him. Okay, last slide in this chapter is evolution is not goal-oriented. It doesn't say, I want to have the perfect fly or I want to have the perfect human being and develop them that way. It's all based upon, everything is kind of a slight modification, and it's only based on what the genetics have and what the environment throws at them. So, it might not be something that's best fit for every environment, but a particular environment, it will be. And it's only modifying what you have already. Okay, so if you don't have any genetic variation, you're not going to have any change. All right. I want to turn to the next chapter, which is chapter 26. Any other questions about the Hox gene stuff? And I want to talk about basically phylogeny and spend some time on that. Phylogeny is a way of exploring and and hypothesizing what the evolutionary relationships of different organisms are to each other. So they give you an example in the textbook of how snakes are related to these things called glass lizards, which look a lot like snakes. But from this phylogenetic tree, they're actually not they're not very related to each other. So that's an example of how we can use those. But before we get there, let me talk a little bit about how we used to, and we still do, I guess, to a certain extent, classify things, which was by something called binomial nomenclature. And this was developed by a guy by the name of Linnaeus. And two parts of his system still remain to this day. And it's binomial nomenclature. The idea that every living organism has a genus name and a species name. So we are Homo sapiens, for example. The first part of that is Homo, and that is our genus. We are the only living people in the genus Homo. Everyone else, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, those are all related to us, but they are now extinct. The second part is specific to the species. So we are sapiens, which means, I think, wise man. And we are the only ones. Sapiens are species, and there are not any other that are within that. To figure out when you're looking at a genus and a species, you want to look at the first letter of the first name is going to be capitalized. So I would say I'm not good about doing capitalization. Homo. And then I would have a small letter sapiens. Okay, everything else is lowercase. And then you would have this italicized. Back before we had computers, the only way we could italicize something was to underline it. And that would be an indication that that was supposed to be italicized. But now we just italicize it. So if it's italicized, the first letter of the first word is capitalized, then you know that you're talking about a genus and a species name. And sometimes that comes up on tests where they will ask you something, and kind of a pre-existing piece of information you need to understand is that what the genus and species name is. That wouldn't be probably the whole question, but it would be part of it. Linnaeus is also responsible for developing a classification system for grouping animals. And it goes domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. Did you all learn that when you were in middle school, or are they kind of getting away from that? They're still doing that? No? Okay. Yeah, they're getting away from it then. We are in kingdom Animalia, for example. We are in the domain Eukarya because we are all eukaryotes. But there are other kingdoms as well. There's the plant kingdom. There's the fungus kingdom. There's the protist kingdom. Am I missing one? Animalia. We have the animal kingdom. And then you can go down and you can look at all of these classifications. And as you get closer and closer to the species, they become more and more related to each other. So there's fewer and fewer organisms, and they're more and more closely related. Now, it's not bolded in your notes, but I bolded it here, is I said that this classification does not necessarily show evolutionary connections between species, meaning that this is how they are currently, and this is how they are related right now at this point in time. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're closely related in terms of having a common ancestor back in time. And that's a big distinction. A lot of this stuff that we're going to talk about is pretty theoretical. Here I've got a leopard, and I can start at the bottom, and the bottom is going to be the most broad. And down here I have 3 different domains. I have bacteria, archaea, and I have eukarya. And so bacteria domain is all the bacteria. Archaea is archaebacteria. So that's more like extremophiles that you find in things like Old Faithful in Yosemite. And then there's domain eukarya, and that's the only domain that has all the eukaryotes. Everything that's eukaryotes is eukarya. And then you go down to kingdom Animalia, and then you can look at all these until you get down to Panthera pardus. And notice how the first letter is capitalized and the rest of it's lowercase, and it's all italicized, and that tells you it's genus and species. Okay. But as you get closer, they could, I think, made this a little bit more dramatic. But as you go down, or up in this case, as you go up to species, it gets narrower and narrower. So there's fewer and fewer animals as you work your way along. So that's classification. And classification is not, like I said, it's only how are they related today. It doesn't look at historical relationships and common ancestors. So phylogeny actually does. Phylogeny tries to look at the evolutionary history of groups of organisms. And this next picture actually looks at trying to put those two together. So if I look at all of these guys here, my leopard and my, that looks like a badger. Badger, otter, my wolf, and my coyote, they all came from a common ancestor that is in the order Carnivoria. Okay, so order being a fairly wide group of organisms. And then you can divide it down into smaller and smaller sections. And as you do so, they start to break off from one another. So I want to talk a little bit more about phylogeny. That's what your activity is going to be today is, did T-Rex taste like chicken? I just don't know. Anyone ever had alligator?
It tastes like chicken.
Oh, I thought it tasted like fish. Really?
Yeah, it tastes like frog.
I didn't like it at all.
I had grilled gator tail and it tastes like chicken.
Wow. Okay. So a phylogeny, the thing about phylogenies and phylogenetic trees, these are evolutionary. They're guesses about the evolutionary history of a group of organisms. They are not necessarily all the be all end all. This is the way it is. This is how they're related to each other. They're guesses, and because of the fact that so much of this is past and it's fossil records and things that we don't have access to, we probably won't at any point be able to go much more than saying it's a guess, a good educated guess. Each branch point is going to represent where two groups of organisms diverge from each other. So they have a common ancestor, a common lineage, but then they diverged out and came to different conclusions. And this one, what's this one? Oh, this is, yeah. So here are some animals. We have fish, frogs, lizards, chimps, and human beings. And at the bottom, we have a common ancestor. Common ancestor down here. And then over time, the fishes branched off, and then the frogs did, and the lizards did, then the chimps did, and then finally humans. Now, this is done in a way that shows humans at kind of the quote pinnacle, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can draw it. You can draw them in a lot of different ways, and these all show that. But the last page and these are exactly the same. They're just sometimes they're done diagonally, sometimes they're done vertically. For whatever reason, College Board likes to test you on them. So we are going to spend some time tomorrow talking about phylogenetic trees, or sometimes they're called cladograms. Same thing. So let's go on here. And phylogenetic trees show patterns of descent, so they do show relatedness. Again, it's a guess. But they don't, one of the things they don't show is the branches are always pretty, unless you just can't draw like me and your lines are not equally spaced. They're supposed to be equally spaced. That doesn't represent that they all took the same amount of time to diverge off. It's just those lines don't show how long ago they evolved. It just says that they did evolve. It could be a really recent event, or it could be a really ancient one. So that isn't shown in the phylogenetic tree. I think I might actually, yeah, I'm going to stop there.